Chapter 13. The Captain and the Weasel. For the rest of term, Murph and his friends tried everything they could think of to persuade Mr. Flash to tell them more about the mysterious blue phantom. Hilda seemed especially fascinated. "What was his armor like?" she asked Mr. Flash the next day, but he pretended he hadn't heard her. She tried again a few times, but eventually he roared directly into her face. "You've had your little history lesson. Now get on with some work." He seemed, if anything, a little embarrassed that he'd allowed himself to get so caught up in his reminiscences. The Christmas holidays passed fairly uneventfully for Murph, if he didn't count all the jokes from Andy about his secret school. Apparently, they were never going to stop being funny. "Is there a Yule ball in the Grey Hall, Smurfface?" he'd asked every day, pirouetting around the kitchen. "Will you dance with Professor McGonagall?" The other notable thing about winter that year was the unusual amount of wasps. The local newspaper had run a story about it before Christmas under the headline Buzz Sember, which was not especially clever on any level. In the article, which Murph read over breakfast one morning, they quoted a pest control expert who said he'd never been called out to so many wasp sightings in winter before, and that the wasps seemed to be of unusual size and totally impossible to catch. One old lady rang up the local radio station trying to insist that they weren't actually wasps, but robots sent to spy on her. The presenters just laughed and played another song. It was on their first day back, an iron-grey January afternoon, when the subject of the blue phantom was raised again. As Murph walked towards the first CT lesson of the new year, he ran into Hilda, who had clearly been doing a lot of thinking over the Christmas break. "I mean," she puffed, trotting alongside him, "I don't understand what happened. If years ago there used to be real superheroes..." "Yes," Murph prompted her. "Then why aren't there superheroes anymore?" asked Hilda. "Well, there are," replied Murph, stopping to think. "But they're, secret now. No more costumes, like Mr. Flash said." "Well, it's a shame about the costumes," sulked Hilda. "I think a real hero should have a costume. If I make it into the Heroes Alliance, I'm totally having one. And what happened to the Blue Phantom? He was the coolest of them all. What if he's still out there somewhere, just waiting to swoop in and rescue people?" "Wouldn't the Blue Phantom be like 80 years old or something by now?" Murph reasoned. "He's not going to be swooping anywhere at that age." But Hilda clearly had a bee in her bonnet about this. Mr. Drench was taking them for CT that morning, and as soon as the class began to settle down, her arm was waving in the air. "Yes, Baker," said Mr. Drench in a bored voice, folding up a newspaper and stuffing it into the pocket of his tweed jacket. "If there used to be superheroes," asked Hilda stridently, "why aren't there proper superheroes anymore?" Mr. Drench screwed his face up. "What on earth do you mean, proper heroes?" Hilda was on a roll. "Real ones with costumes like the Blue Phantom. You know about him, don't you?" "Of course," the teacher replied, slightly reluctantly. "Aha! Well, what happened to him then?" asked Hilda triumphantly. "Did he die? What was his costume made of?" No, don't worry about the costume for now. But what happened to him? What was his catchphrase? No, don't worry about that either." Mr. Drench paused and glanced around at the expectant class, looking a little like a sleepy zoo animal surrounded by wide-eyed onlookers. With his inquisitive mind whizzing, Murph forced the issue. "Why was the Blue Phantom the greatest, Mr. Drench?" he said. The teacher sighed, trapped. "Look, let's just say that the Blue Phantom was different. A hero for heroes. The sort of character who saves the people normally doing the saving." There was a pause. Murph, at the back of the class, got an inkling that there was more of a story here. "Did he save you?" he asked quietly. Mr. Drench looked even more uncomfortable. Well, he said finally, "you could put it like that." "How? When?" asked Hilda and more or less everyone else. "When else?" replied Mr. Drench simply. "When all hope was gone." He sat down, looking thoughtful and serious. "I haven't always just been Mr. Drench the CT teacher, he began. "We've all got a past.
The day I first met the Phantom was also the first day I came into contact with the most dangerous enemy of them all. A day I wish to forget. The day I lost.
He trailed off.
Lost what?
Breathed Hilda eventually.
The day I lost everything,
said Mr. Drench dejectedly.
And the day I realized the true role of the sidekick. Tough job being a sidekick, you know. People don't understand the sacrifice. Certainly not Captain Alpha, anyway.
Who's Captain Alpha? Asked Hilda, hardly daring to believe they were finding out so much. Murph suddenly remembered when he'd first met Mr. Drench, and something else clicked into place in his brain. It's Superman! He exclaimed. Mr. Drench raised his eyebrows in surprise. He seemed slightly annoyed with himself for giving the game away.
Yes, he was Captain Alpha, the strongest man on this or any planet, and I was known as the Weasel.
Weasel? Asked Hilda incredulously.
Yes, Weasel,
he said defensively.
Weasels are actually fascinating animals. They're, very wily and cunning.
That's foxes.
No, it's definitely weasels, and they have astonishing hearing, which is, of course, my own capability. Although my hearing has never been quite as exceptional since that day.
So that's what you lost? Murph wanted to know. You lost your cape?
Part of it,
said the artist formerly known as the Weasel, sadly.
That's what happened to anyone who came up against him. Luckily, the Blue Phantom saved me before my whole capability could be stolen.
Did Captain Alpha lose part of his power too? Hilda asked in a hushed voice.
Oh no,
said Mr. Drench.
We'd split up, and I was the one who encountered our enemy first. But maybe I was thought to be the expendable one. Not all capabilities are considered equal, as you are no doubt learning from Mr. Flash. It's certainly a lesson I learned that day.
Mr. Drench fidgeted. A few beads of sweat had appeared on his brow. Clearly he was uncomfortable talking about this subject.
Let's leave that discussion there, shall we?
He asked, eyes flitting around nervously.
What's done is done, and there's no point going over old ground. But that's what happened. It was I who was sent in alone to face Magpie.
He'd definitely said too much this time. Magpie? Who on earth is that? Said Murph.
The worst nightmare of everyone in this room. Apart from you, Mr. Cooper,
replied the teacher dryly.
But not the subject of this lesson, I'm afraid.
The class let out a groan of protest as he turned and began to write on the board.
Today we'll continue our discussion of how to prevent accidental cape activation.
His head full of questions, Murph wandered along to the lunch hall by himself later. As he entered, he looked up at the stone tablet bearing the hero's vow, realizing the world of heroes was bigger and more sinister than he'd imagined, and how much more there was to fear. For the first time, it struck him that a world of superheroes brings with it the possibility of a world of supervillains. Murph shuffled forwards in the lunch queue towards whatever delights awaited him. As he was quite short, he could only see the steam rising off the serving trays, but was aware of the frantic motioning of the dinner ladies as they slopped and splattered the food onto the plates, like robots on a production line. Friendly robots, though, Murph thought. Robots called Edna, with hairnets. He patiently waited his turn as he edged towards the front of the queue. Suddenly, it turned into a very good day. It was his favourite, spaghetti and meatballs with garlic bread, and even better than that, it was a fresh batch. We all know what a great feeling it is watching the poor sucker before you get the scrapings from the tired, burned dish, and then seeing the new one sliding into place. Murph was first in line. The new dish was all his. It's the lunchtime equivalent of getting into bed and realizing there are clean sheets, except in this case, the sheets were covered in delicious tomato sauce, with cheese pillows. Murph was moments away from watching the spoon make its first trip into the glistening meat fest, when a sharp push to his ribs knocked him backwards. The people behind him in the queue grumbled as he staggered into them. Murph looked round in confusion. It appeared that no one had touched him, and by the time he turned back, there was someone else being served the aforementioned glistening meat fest. It was a tall, gangly, spotty kid with a wispy moustache that hung above his lip like it was embarrassed to be there. "Oops, did you fall over?" he asked sarcastically.
Hey, you pushed in and pushed me.
"I think," replied a confused Murph. The moustached boy just laughed, grabbed the last 3 slices of garlic bread, and lolloped off. Murph was so aghast at the whole situation that he hadn't realized that the rest of the queue had since swarmed past him to collect their food. The line now snaked right back to the door, and he was no longer in it. This was unfair, and Murph hated injustice. Besides, lunch was the only thing he'd been looking forward to that day. Thanks to growing up with a smelly big brother, he wasn't afraid of sticking up for himself. So he started to march over to where the gangly queue jumper had sat down and was about to address him when he noticed who was sitting at the table with him. The boy was surrounded by what could only be described as a terrifying collection of teenage monsters. Murph quickly nicknamed them all in his head to try and keep calm. Alongside gangly Fuzzface were Pork Belly Pig Breath, Corned Beef Boy, Crazy Eyes Jemima, and, last but not least, Frankenstein's nephew. It was a shame, he thought, that these names would never see the light of day, but it was probably safer that way. At this point, Murph realized he'd been standing there staring at this array of beasts and naming them silently for around 90 seconds. They'd all stopped chewing and were staring back at him, except for Jemima. You were never quite sure what she was looking at.
What?
Screamed Jemima suddenly and at the top of her voice.
He pushed me out of the way and took my place in the queue,
Murph replied. And, grunted Corned Beef Boy, what are you going to do about it? Murph started feeling a bit worried. Hang on, isn't this the kid with no cape? Said one of the goons. Why are we in school anyway? Said another. Yeah, push off, laughed Fuzzface. And once again, Murph felt a powerful shove in the center of his chest. He instantly recoiled, stumbling back uncontrollably into a huge pile of dirty plates. The plates hesitated for a moment, tottered playfully from side to side, and then decided to make a nuisance of themselves and cascade everywhere. They fell backwards, showering the table behind, where, to his horror, Murph could see the bald head and broad back of Mr. Flash. A bald head and broad back that were now covered in splodges of tomato sauce and hoops of spaghetti. Fuzzface and his friends all scattered, terrified of being connected to what had happened. Mr. Flash got to his feet and turned around slowly, like one of those ballerinas in a music box, only without the frilly skirt. His face was red, and not just because there was a significant amount of tomato sauce dripping down it, like savory magma from an erupting volcano. He picked a morsel of chewed garlic bread from his moustache and surveyed the scene. It didn't look good for Murph, who was standing right beside the smashed pile of plates. "Did you do that, Cooper?" shouted Mr. Flash. Murph considered several possible answers to this question, but he only got as far as, before Mr. Flash had identified another possible culprit. "Or was it you, you great liability?" he roared over Murph's shoulder. Murph spun around and saw the boy from his class who could inflate different parts of his body. He looked absolutely terrified of being shouted at by a tomato-flavored monster like this, and in his panic, one of his hands suddenly ballooned, sending his glass of milk flying. This did nothing to calm Mr. Flash down. "It was you, wasn't it, you clumsy little... You've ballooned all the blinking plates over, haven't you?" The boy made a small whimpering noise and edged along the bench as if trying to escape, one of his ears inflating with a high-pitched whining sound. "Problem, Mr. Flash?" said a voice. Murph spun round again and was relieved to see Flora, the old lady who sat outside the head's office, carrying a cup of tea. "Oh, you seem to be covered in bolognese," she went on helpfully.
We should go and get you cleaned up.
Mr. Flash made a spluttering noise and flicked a meatball off his shoulder.
Come along,
continued Flora brightly, and she led him away firmly by the arm, but not before turning to Murph with a wink.
That was a close one,
said the inflated hand boy.
I'm Billy, by the way.
Murph, said Murph, holding out his hand.
Yeah, I know who you are.
Kid Naught, don't even go there, balloon boy, said Murph, but with a smile.
Hey,
said Billy.
If you get to call me Balloon Boy, then you're Kid Normal.
Billy it is then, Murph decided.
Nice to meet you, Murph,
replied Billy.
I quite like Balloon Boy as it goes. Anyway, have a seat. I've got some garlic bread left.